our speaker, Mr. Andrew Feinstein. And on that note, I'd like to introduce Mr. Andrew Feinstein from Corruption Watch UK. He will be giving us a presentation on the global context of the arms deal. Thank you, Mr. Feinstein.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. First, may I thank the organizers for this event and for the invitation to present here. By way of background, I am a former ANC Member of Parliament. My primary role in the National Parliament was to chair the subcommittee of the Finance Committee that drafted the Public Finance Management Act, Act 1 of 2000, that governed public sector financial management in our democracy. Thereafter, I was the ranking ANC member on the Standing Committee on Public Accounts. I am also, as mentioned, the Executive Director of Corruption Watch UK, a small London-based NGO. I'm an investigative researcher and writer on the global arms trade and have been for the past more than 17 years. My experience in the South African Parliament in relation to the so-called South African arms deal was documented in a book called After the Party. This was followed by a book called The Shadow World, Inside the Global Arms Trade, on which Paul Holden, who will be giving evidence next, was the lead researcher. The Washington Post described the book as the most complete account of the global arms trade ever written. It has been made into a feature documentary film that has been seen around the world, most recently on public television across the United States. Evidence of my characterization of the global trade in weapons is contained extensively in this book, and it's over 2,800 footnotes. I've been asked to provide the global context in which the South African arms deal occurred, as well as very briefly my experience of that deal as a Member of Parliament. I must apologize that I will only have time to deal with these issues in a cursory manner, but please do ask any aspect you would like more detailed information on. The trade in weapons is an important dimension of national defense, a tool of foreign policy, and a contributor, albeit overstated, to our economies. However, the arms trade, big and small, has additional profound impacts on the world. It is a massive contributor to global corruption, diverts revenue from crucial socio-economic spending, enables, fuels, and perpetuates conflict and repression, and undermines development and democracy. On average, global military expenditure totals around $1.7 trillion a year. That is $235 for every person on the planet. The trade in conventional arms, both big and small, is worth anywhere from $60 to $150 billion a year. It's important to note that arms deals stretch across a continuum of legality and ethics, from what is described as the official or formal trade to the grey and black markets. In practice, the boundaries between these three markets are extremely fuzzy. They are often intertwined and dependent on each other. With bribery and corruption commonplace, there are very few arms transactions that do not involve illegality, most often through intermediaries and more often through the use of complex offset schemes. There are many arms dealers, sometimes described as agents or brokers, depending on their intermediation role, who provide services to large defense companies and governments while continuing to operate in the black and grey markets, a number of whom I've interviewed over the years. Both black and grey deals frequently contravene arms embargoes, national and multilateral laws, agreements, and regulations. As Professor James Stewart's research team at the University of British Columbia in Canada established, as at around 2011, of the approximately 502 violations of UN arms embargoes recorded by the UN itself, there are only 2 instances where this has led to legal accountability of any sort, and only 1 case led to prosecution. This reflects that those involved in this trade operate in something of a parallel legal universe, where they seldom face the legal consequences of their actions, which are often justified in the name of national security and defense. Part of the reason for this is that the global arms trade witnesses massive collusion between companies and governments, politicians, political parties, the military, and intelligence agencies, not as some dark, deep conspiracy, but as part of the everyday functioning of each. One intermediary, who became known popularly as the Merchant of Death for the pervasiveness of his arms transactions across the globe, especially across the African continent during the multiple conflicts of the late 1980s and 1990s, was providing his services to the United States Department of Defense and at least 3 large US defense contractors during the invasion of Iraq at exactly the same time that there was an Interpol red notice for his arrest. Many of the intermediaries I have investigated over the years act as intelligence assets for multiple governments simultaneously, thereby often avoiding the legal consequences of their actions. In the most famous political manifestation of the collusion between political parties, arms deals, and defense companies, I cite in the shadow world the remarkable example of the former and now late German Bundeskanzler Helmut Kohl, who funded his Christian Democratic Union for over 16 years, primarily on the proceeds of licit and illicit arms deals. It is partly as a consequence of this collusion that the trade in weapons is the most corrupt of all trades. In a remarkable piece of work, Joe Rober of Transparency International at the time calculated, using seldom available data from intelligence agencies and national treasuries, that the trade in weapons accounts for 40% of all corruption in all global trade. A US Department of Commerce study that examined corrupt deals over an arbitrary 5-year period found that over 50% of the corrupt deals identified were in the American defense sector. But why, in addition to the relationships between the state, intermediaries, defense corporations, and other arms of the military, is the arms trade so susceptible to corruption? Rober's work argues compellingly that the arms trade is hardwired for corruption. It is the very structure of the trade that explains the prevalence and nature of the corruption that characterizes it. It is even built into the economics of individual arms deals and the trade as a whole. But to try and put it simply, in the so-called formal or legal trade, often undertaken between governments, you have a relatively small number of contracts, on average half a dozen a year, each of which is worth billions of dollars to the country and to the company or companies. These small numbers of contracts are decided on by an extremely small number of people in each of the buying countries. And most crucially of all of this activity around weapons transactions takes place behind a veil of national security imposed secrecy. This corruption and the efforts to conceal it undermine the rule of law in buying and selling countries, distort the market, and pollute the business environment, the political process, and the functioning of the state. They also, very importantly, often result in the purchase of inappropriate military equipment, the most obvious example of which at the moment is the most expensive weapons system ever produced, the American F-35 jet fighter, which is being produced at a cost to the American taxpayer of $1.5 trillion. A number of Pentagon insiders, as well as some elements of the defense intelligence establishment in the US and across the world, argue that this jet fighter will be of little or no use in current conflicts that the United States finds itself engaged in, and in any likely future conflicts for generations to come. Most remarkably of all, this incredibly expensive weapons system failed its first 14 test flights. But it is being sold at extremely high cost to 25 countries around the world. The biggest arms deal of all time, what is arguably the most corrupt commercial transaction in history, was a deal named the Al-Yamamah deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, which was worth 43 billion pounds. On this transaction, according to the Serious Fraud Office and the Metropolitan Police in London, 6 billion pounds of commissions were paid. The vast majority of them to middlemen, decision makers, and those who procured the deal for the United Kingdom in what you and I would normally understand as bribes. They included over 1 billion pounds paid to the son of the Saudi defense minister at the time of the deal, and 12 million pounds paid to Mark Thatcher, the son of Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, who negotiated the transaction. Tony Blair, in the last months of his premiership, forced the United Kingdom's Serious Fraud Office to close down their over 5-year investigation into the deal, citing national security concerns. BAE Systems, the company that fulfilled the Al-Yamamah contract and paid the bribes, was soon again under investigation, this time for 6 other corrupt deals around the world. They were eventually fined a derisory £500,000 for accounting irregularities on the smallest of the deals in Tanzania. In addition, the Serious Fraud Office agreed not to allege corruption on the part of the company or any of its agents or subsidiaries on any of these contracts around the world. One of these was what has become known as the South African arms deal, which my colleague Paul Holden will give detailed evidence on in the next session. Our young democracy decided to spend between 61 and 71 billion rand on weapons. Weapons that arguably we did not need and that have definitively been underutilized since their purchase. Conservatively, we, and when I say we, I mean my research colleagues, including Paul Holden and myself, estimate that 2.2 billion rand in corrupt payments occurred to officials and middlemen. I attempted to investigate this deal in my capacity as the ranking ANC member on Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Accounts. It was clear in the report of the Auditor General submitted to the committee that there was prima facie evidence of significant corruption in the transactions. Scopa, the committee, as we did with every other report, pursued the matter in a vigorous and non-party political basis. The reaction of the ANC leadership, which had been supportive of our endeavors to hold the state to account for financial spending, on this particular report was astonishing. I was called in by numerous people, starting from close colleagues with whom I was friendly, to the Speaker of Parliament at the time, the Secretary General of my party, and the Presidency, to try and persuade me to halt the committee's investigation. My refusal led to my being removed from the committee and then being forced out of Parliament, to be replaced by a loyal whip who proceeded to ultimately prevent Scopa investigating the deal. In addition, independent bodies, including the National Prosecuting Authority, the Office of the Public Protector, and the Hawks Investigative Unit, were directed as to what and whom they could and could not investigate. The so-called Heath Investigative Unit was denied permission by the President to participate in the inquiry at all. The arms deal and its cover-up were, as the Mail and Guardian editorialized at the time, the point at which South Africa's nascent democracy lost its moral compass. Our current president, Jacob Zuma, faced 783 counts of corruption, fraud, and racketeering in relation to the deal. These charges were controversially dropped, but as a consequence of recent court decisions, may well be reinstated. For the money spent on the weapons we bought, and I repeat, many of which have been underutilized to this day, South Africa could have built 2 million houses, or created 100,000 new low-entry jobs a year for 10 years. Not to mention the woeful underspending on addressing the HIV and AIDS pandemic, which Zaki Ahmad will speak to tomorrow. Besides these socio-economic opportunity costs, our politics have been deeply besmirched by this deal, which sadly is just one not uncommon example of the activities and modus operandi of the global trade in weapons. It was the moment when state and party were fused, when the use of state contracts to materially benefit members of the state became acceptable, when key institutions of our democracy were undermined in order to protect members of the state. But we should not despair, because an enormous amount can be done and continues to be done, not just in South Africa, but globally. Most crucially is the role in which this process is such an important part of ensuring that information is put into the public domain from those who conduct these transactions, who use national security secrecy to hide what is no different to criminal conduct. There is significant activism and growing activism around the world against the nature and functioning of the trade in weapons. Many people, including the leader of the opposition in the British Parliament, believe that the conduct of the global trade in arms is simply unacceptable. And finally, there is the important route of legal advocacy, of using the court system at its various levels to hold to account governments, companies, and individuals who engage in corruption and ensure that weapons of war find their way into conflicts. For if we don't do this, we will ensure that the global trade in arms will continue to make our nations more corrupt, less democratic, and perhaps most ironically, less safe. I thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Would you have any objections to being asked some questions?
Absolutely not.
All right. Do any of the evidence speakers want to start before we
We are fine. Thank you very much, Member Jacob.
All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. Your presentation takes us, or some of us, back to a moment in our history, which is still with us, but the details of which are fading. So thanks for that. I have just one question, and I just wanted you to speak about the global arms industry and the sort of what I call the world division of labor between maybe the North and the South, and how power relations within what you call the global arms industry are uneven. And the reason I'm asking that, it will enlighten us about the susceptibility of states in the South to some of the pressures at play.
Thank you, sir, for the question. It will come as no surprise to you to discover that the main weapons producers are companies located primarily in countries of the global North. The United States of America produces in any given year between 30 and 45% of all weaponry that is made in the world. The United States also purchases a similar percentage of all armaments that are produced in the world. The next biggest countries tend to be the countries of Western Europe, led by the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Belgium, and Holland. Israel is an extremely important player in the global trade in weapons, particularly when it comes to what could be described as high technology weaponry. So, for instance, the manufacture of drone aircraft, which play an ever more important role in warfare today, was pioneered in Israel. There are, of course, companies and countries of the global South where weaponry is produced. And here, the two biggest and most obvious examples would be, and I would say that the categorization of which part of the globe they are in is open to some interpretation, but China and Russia would be the largest amongst those. But we find today countries like Bulgaria, for instance, in Eastern Europe, producing significant numbers of weapons. There are other countries that play an extremely important role in the logistical movement of weapons around the globe. And here I speak, for instance, of the country where I am based, the United Kingdom, which acts as something of a fulcrum for the movement of new and second-hand weapons from various producing countries in the world into various of the using countries of the world, with completely inadequate controls of that movement of weaponry. Now, quite clearly, one of the biggest problems in the adequate control of the manufacture and export of weaponry is due to the fact that the vast majority of members of the United Nations Security Council are themselves large-scale weapons producers. And therefore, they have very little interest in a more profound regulation of the trade. So, in June of 2014, an international arms trade treaty was signed at the United Nations. And many, many countries of the world have signed onto that treaty. However, the treaty is extremely weak, and it has resulted in no discernible change in the nature of the export of arms. And this is most obviously seen in the country that was one of the loudest champions of this treaty, the United Kingdom, which, in violation of that treaty, and I would argue its own laws, as well as the EU's common position on arms exports, continues to export billions of pounds of weaponry, including bombs and missiles, to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, while Saudi Arabia leads an air war in Yemen that has resulted in the deaths of over 14,000 innocent civilians not as collateral damage, but actually of conscious targets of both the Saudi-led coalition and the other forces in Yemen. I hope that gives some indication of your...
Thank you.
You indicated that there were, I think you said that there were 2 cases where legal accountability and 1 trial earlier. Can you just elucidate a little bit on that statement, please? Can you just say a little bit more about those?
Certainly. So, the United Nations itself employs people to investigate the flow of weapons into embargoed conflicts. So this might be, for instance, historically, into any aspect of the Balkans conflict. It might be into the conflicts of Liberia and Sierra Leone, for instance, of Sudan, South Sudan, historically in the African continent. These reports are then submitted to a body in the United Nations, and they ultimately, where appropriate, land up at the Security Council. Unfortunately, in most instances, long before they even reach the Security Council, it is decided not to proceed with any of these matters. So the 2 cases that were proceeded with somehow fell between the cracks, if you will. And my assumption in the 2 cases is because they involved very small arms producers, not particularly well-known intermediaries who were not intelligence assets or of great value to any of the members of the Security Council, I would suggest that that is perhaps why those 2 cases proceeded. The 1 case which did lead to a legal prosecution and the payment of a fine involved an arms dealer who is based in Beirut in Lebanon, who sold weapons into the Balkans conflict, which was entirely embargoed. Interestingly, some of those weapons came from apartheid South Africa. The gentleman concerned made extortionate profits on these transactions, as the reality of a UN arms embargo for an arms intermediary is that they enable these intermediaries to charge a premium on the goods that they are selling, because they are running legal risks in theory, because the logistics of transporting this weaponry into the conflict are more difficult than would usually be the case. This gentleman was then tried in Switzerland, where the transaction had been negotiated. He was found guilty of what was described as an immoral transaction of business. And he was fined what, in relation to the profits that he made on the contract, was really pocket change. However, he was outraged. And one of the reasons he agreed to be interviewed by me while I was researching the book, The Shadow World, was because he felt that his conviction itself was immoral.
I think this is very impressive research, and I wish you would tell us a little bit of how you researched an area that is really official secrets and so on, because it will be very instructive for people looking at these issues here as
Yes.
well. And that's one. So you addressed yourself to the legal armed trade. Did you also look at the illicit armed trade?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. In terms of the investigative methods, ironically, my misfortunes as a South African Member of Parliament provided other unexpected opportunities, in that I left South Africa in late 2001, soon after I resigned from Parliament. And on arriving in the United Kingdom, I was approached by the Serious Fraud Office, by military police, by the 2 main intelligence agencies, by the Metropolitan Police, and by the City of London International Anti-Corruption Unit, who had heard about the South African case and were looking into BAE Systems' involvement in that case. I was able to elucidate for them certain aspects of how the corruption had taken place in the South African deal. I had come to this information as part of the Public Accounts Committee's investigative process here before we were stopped from continuing that investigation. But what that did is, and I should make clear, that there are very few people who research and particularly who write publicly about this trade because of the difficulty of accessing this information for the very reason that you state. For instance, before the first edition of The Shadow World was published globally in late 2011, the previous book on the global arms trade had been published in 1979 by a wonderful British writer who also had history in South Africa, Anthony Sampson. But my experience in South Africa had given me an insight into the way in which this trade works, an insight that was extremely useful to prosecutors who did attempt to at least investigate some of these cases. So I cooperated with a serious fraud office over a period of years. I was then approached by a number of other prosecutors in the United States, in Switzerland, in Germany, in Italy. I'm trying to think of other jurisdictions, of which there are a few, which escape me at the moment. And I assisted them in terms of understanding the nature of this trade. And of course, what this did is it gave me access to some of the cases in which an investigation has been attempted around the world, even though the vast majority of those, for the obvious reasons I've stated, have not been successful investigations and or prosecutions. In addition, what that did is it, I suppose, in some ways communicated to this community of people who work on this area that here was somebody who knew something about it and who was writing about it. And an extraordinary number of people approached me. These included whistleblowers from within the companies, from within governments, from within prosecutorial offices, I should state, but also, ironically, arms dealers themselves. One of the things that seems fairly common to those arms dealers I've met, and I've clearly only met a very small fraction of them, is that they have extremely large egos. And when they hear that somebody is researching their area of activity, some of them have actually been put out by the fact that I have not contacted them. And this has brought me into contact with quite a number of the arms dealers who are mentioned in the book. In addition to that, we are very fortunate in our very small organization to have an expertise, which I must credit primarily Paul Holden with, of utilizing publicly available online sources of information to investigate arms transactions. And when Paul and I, many years ago, first started working together, I must admit, being quite a bit older than him and not nearly as technologically savvy, that I was actually astonished at how much is available online if one knows where and how to find it. An extraordinary number of court documents, company registration papers, and this has enabled us to add to what I would describe as our human sources and to provide on an ongoing basis what we believe is an accurate picture of the functioning of the global arms trade. And we continue to investigate particular transactions, particular companies, particular governments, and particular individuals engaged in these activities around the world. The second part to your question, Amina.
Just whether you looked at illicit
Yes.
arms trade.
So the point that I try to make is that it is incredibly difficult, I believe, and I say this with the caveat that I have no legal training, but I think it is extremely difficult to believe, to distinguish the legal and illegal trades. So the so-called legal trade, which is this formal state-to-state trade, is permeated with illegality in the form of bribery and corruption primarily, in the form of the procurement of sometimes completely inappropriate equipment. We're aware, for instance, of a current case we're looking into, where technical specifications were simply changed by a government official to ensure that a particular company who produced a piece of equipment that did not meet the actual requirements of their government, that they could still get paid billions of dollars for a piece of equipment that was of absolutely no use to the purchasing government. So even those most legal and formal components of the trade I regard as having elements of illegality in them. But in terms of those trades that are illegal in conception and execution from start to finish, usually between informal non-state actors and unscrupulous intermediaries, yes, we do follow some of those, because it is extremely important to have an understanding of that part of the trade to be able to fully understand the more formal dimensions of the trade, because it is at the formal dimensions that we are most keen to intervene in terms of the legislative and regulatory environment and in terms of the enforcement regime.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Feinstein, thank you very much. May I start by tapping on your knowledge of the political circumstances in 1994 in the light of some of the other evidence that was led here? May I?
Certainly.
Okay. So, I mean, you and I were both part of the African National Congress, now no longer part of it, I dare say, for different reasons. But be that as it may, at that time, the illicit arms deal was a huge target for attack, right, as far as we were concerned.
Yeah.
It was a very serious matter. Politically, it was a very important issue. One would have expected that in 1994, bearing in mind that reconciliation had nothing to do with it, that in 1994, bearing in mind the history and the role of the illicit arms trade in supporting apartheid, that something would have been done politically to ensure the prosecution of those crimes. And I wondered whether, the thesis has been advanced here that the failure to investigate and prosecute those crimes has been directly responsible for the crimes that occurred in 1999 and thereafter. So I want to know firstly whether you agree with that continuity element, and secondly whether you can give any idea from your knowledge of the reason why, in the light of the fact that the illicit arms trade was such an anathema to all of us in those days, nothing was done about it later.
Thank you very much for the question, sir. In terms of the continuity, first may I state, which, given your and my political allegiances of the past, as you've elucidated, won't come as a surprise to you, is I believe that the apartheid system was systemically corrupt in both theory and practice. Yeah. So, as Henny van Vuuren's extraordinary book has illuminated, illegal arms transactions violating the arms embargo in place on apartheid South Africa was stock in trade of this administration with the support of a variety of very prominent business people both here and abroad, and a very surprising array of international governments. My own experience of it that might elucidate your question to some extent is that I was also in the fortunate position of being part of the secretariat at the constitutional negotiations that took place at the World Trade Center in 1991. And I recall in those negotiations how, especially around lunchtime and sometimes after proceedings had ended in the evening, sometimes late at night, there was always a quota of very smartly dressed, besuited gentlemen at the World Trade Center near Johannesburg International Airport. Years later, when I had reason to interact with the members of the National Prosecuting Authority in this country who attempted to investigate our arms deal, I raised this with them. And they informed me that some of these people were executives from international companies. I discovered later, as my own research developed into the arms trade, that some of them were very senior executives from some of the world's biggest arms companies around the world. And these were people that already had well-established, and I would argue quite solid, contact with leading members of the apartheid state. And they were using these contacts to be introduced to those who they thought were going to be crucial in our imminent democratic future. So I would, with your indulgence, like to only focus on the arms dimension of this, because it is the area that I know best. And I would like not to speak about matters that I don't have significant evidentiary proof for. But when we track the South African arms deal, which my colleague Paul Holden and I have done in great detail for many, many years now, what strikes us is that all of the companies involved, without exception, had relations with the apartheid state. And that in fact it appeared to us that an arms deal of the size, scale, and nature of the deal that came to be signed in 1999 was already being contemplated in the late apartheid era. And that all that was done was that this deal was shifted to the new political leadership. And I think perhaps more than any other example that we have, this shows the elision of corruption from the old order into the new. And it's why I often ruminate that South Africa is not very different to many other countries. For me, the tragedy was discovering how many other countries had been taken in by the wiles of the large defense corporations around the world. I suppose the sadness for me is how quickly it happened in our case, how quickly we adopted the very tawdry global norms that applied to both the politics and economics of these sorts of deals. And it is in that elision from the old order to the new that I think the almost seamless pace of that change and of the continuation is evidenced. In terms of why this deal was covered up in the way it was, when many of us, as you mentioned, within the ruling party, many organizations and prominent individuals in civil society could see the dangers of this deal and could see the wastage of expenditure. And I do not have multiple sources of evidentiary proof for this, but I think it is worth noting an anecdote that I recall in my first book, After the Party, in which I was called to the house one Sunday lunchtime of a close friend and comrade of mine who served on the ANC's National Executive Committee at the time, when I first started to come under pressure in Parliament for wanting to pursue this investigation. And he said to me in very comradely fashion, "Andrew, you need to understand that on this arms deal, you cannot win." And I said to him, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You need to understand that if you pursue this deal, nothing will come of those efforts, and it will lead to the end of your political career." Now, the latter didn't bother me too much, because I am of the view that every political career ends in failure of one sort or another. But secondly, I was deeply concerned about why such a senior member of the ruling party thought that these efforts could not lead anywhere. And his response to me was that, "Andrew, you need to understand that part of the proceeds of this arms deal not only went to very senior people in our young democracy, but some of them also went to the African National Congress itself, And he then said to me, how do you think we financed the 1999 election campaign? And while I cannot definitively stand here and state that I have documentary evidence that bears out what I was told, I would find it extraordinary that someone who I was both personally and politically close to, who had both my best interests and the best interests of the party foremost in his thoughts, would have said something like that to me. Subsequently, 2 other senior members of the party, when trying to persuade me to stop the investigation, said the same thing to me. And I feel that the main reason such lengths were gone to by the very people who had fought and sacrificed so much for the creation of our democracy, to the extent that they would be prepared to undermine some of the key institutions of that democracy, was because of the damage that they perceived it would do to the ANC itself.
I had a slightly positive spin on it, slightly more. I wonder whether you'd comment on it. Was there perhaps in some circles initially, and I'm interested in why the previous lot weren't prosecuted, was there the thinking that, well, we have our democracy now, we must constructively develop our country, and we mustn't rock the boat too much in relation to big business, because if we do, it might have an impact on reconciliation and that sort of thing. Was there perhaps that sort of thinking too?
So I think that there was undoubtedly, and any transaction of this magnitude and impact is going to have a number of factors that motivate it. And there is no doubt in my mind that amongst the factors that motivated the deal, rather than the cover-up to the deal, were the fact that we did believe it would particularly contribute to reconciliation, especially amongst some of the old military leaders from the apartheid era. That secondly, there was a feeling that it could help to develop our industrial base, because I do believe that there were some ministers at the time who felt quite strongly that a major arms transaction with a number of economic and industrial offsets for the country could kickstart an industry in which we had already a fair basis because of the militarism of the apartheid regime, and that is the defense sector. So I think that those were both well intended. I think that the second of those was deeply erroneous, and that even a cursory study of the reality of the economics of the arms industry, and especially of so-called offsets globally, would have actually been quite convincing in how this deal was not going to play that role. Then I think there was a third consideration, which was that we could almost reward some of our most important allies who had assisted us in the struggle against apartheid, which included the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, both of whose companies won contracts that they didn't even make the shortlists for the technical specifications of. So I think there was that geopolitical element to it as well. However, sir, in addition to that, I do believe that there were somewhat less salubrious motivations as well. And one of the most important is that I would not be at all surprised if the defense contractor executives of whom I spoke, having had presence at the World Trade Center during our constitutional negotiations, had also mentioned to some of our emerging political leaders that massive arms deals are an extremely good way to fund a political party, and that in fact they have been used in this way not only in many parts of the African continent, but in many parts of what we would refer to as the global north as well.
Thank you. I have only one slight problem with your evidence before I ask you one more question, and that
Certainly.
is the use of the word gentleman in the context in which it was used, but I accept that that comes from a lack of knowledge of figures of speech in English on my part. By my calculation, am I right that America spends $1,000 per American person a day, more or less, on defense?
Yes, sir.
And We can work it out later, but since you're here, how much do we spend a day per person?
I actually don't know those figures. We don't have a final figure for all of our defense. What I would suggest is it would be what I would call national security and defense spending. So that would include spending on our military, on weaponry and on person power for that military, as well as operational spending. But then we would have to include our intelligence agencies and other agencies that contributed to the national security and defense effort. But let me undertake to try and put as much of that figure that is in the public domain, let us try and put that together for you and make the calculation, as I think it would be interesting to compare with other parts of the world, including the US, which is perhaps the most militarized country on the planet, sadly.
I think I and some of my colleagues would actually like that very much, because it puts our spending and what happened in relation to us in context. Mr. Feinstein, thank you very much for giving what I consider to be important evidence before us, and thank you for taking the trouble.
Thank you for your time.